We fill our books with fictional things, people, places, events. But what if the books themselves are fictional? That is one of the things that postmodernists tackled, and I would say tackled successfully, and I've got some examples for you here. So we're going to start with Jorge Luis Borges. Borges, of course, was in my 10 Titans of Postmodern Fiction and is just a foundational postmodernist author. And this book, Labyrinths, is amazing. I'm going to call out two stories from this that really deserve discussion. The first one is Tlön Akbar Orbis Tertius, probably his most famous story. And Tlön Akbar Orbis Tertius orbits around or circles around this volume of an encyclopedia. One volume of an entire, like 30 volume or so encyclopedia. Just one for this world called Tlön that appears to be an alternative to Earth. It's an alternate Earth. It's not Earth. It's Tlön. And Tlön has different geography and culture and language and science, and all of these things are different. And there's only one volume of this encyclopedia. And so we just get kind of a slice of a look at Tlön and what Tlön is. And much of the story is discussing Tlön. And what's interesting, of course, is that this is a fictional book, an imaginary book that has thrust itself into our real world. It's an encyclopedia, a document that explains and documents a world, but the world it's documenting isn't real, right? It's fictional. And so, that's a neat concept. Another very neat concept that Borges has that's directly relevant to this is his short story, Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. And what happens in Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, is a French structuralist poet named Pierre Menard. So kind of a specific, isolated brand of French modernism named Pierre Menard. He decides he's going to write Don Quixote. He's not going to rewrite it. He's not going to take the basic story or narratives and update or modernize it. He's going to write it word for word the same, but instead of being this novel that was written by a 17th century Spaniard, it's being written by a turn of the 20th century French structuralist. And as such, the implications of the book, even though it's word for word identical, are vastly different. And so in so doing, Pierre Menard is basically, he's reinventing and he's changing Don Quixote, and he's giving us a new version of Don Quixote. It's a wonderful story. We'll deep dive on that a little more later because it's so great. But at one point, there's one point where Borges actually reads the exact same quote twice. He says, so when Cervantes says, and he puts out this quote, he says, it's not all that interesting, it's yada, yada, yada. But when Menard says, and then he has the exact same quote, the implications are enormous, right? And so it's super funny because it's the exact same quote twice. And then he actually, I do want to quote this part. And then he goes on and he has this little paragraph. So here you are. There's one quote and then the exact same quote, right? And then he says, the contrast in style is also vivid. The archaic style of Menard, quite foreign after all, suffers from a certain affectation. Not so that of his forerunner, who handles with ease the current Spanish of his time, right? So the fact that this is being written in an older version of Spanish by this more contemporary, at the time of writing, Frenchman has implications on his being affected, right? So it's also sort of an imaginary re-rendition of Don Quixote. So that's a start. Now, these are still characters inside fictional books, and they're fictional things that are going on inside those books. So can we do better? Well, we sure can. So the next one we're going to look at is Stanislaw Lem. Stanislaw Lem, primarily a science fiction writer, in fact, completely a science fiction writer, sometimes very much a traditionalist, but sometimes as postmodern as anybody gets. And this is an example of this. So Stanislaw Lem published a number of what he calls real reviews of imaginary books. And those are in 2 volumes that I have, Imaginary Magnitude and One Human Minute. These are both full of these real reviews of imaginary books. And what they are is they are lengthy reviews, lengthy book reviews of books that don't exist. So Lem doesn't write the books. He writes the reviews about the books. And then as we read the review, we construct a fictional book, an imaginary book in our mind to match the artifact we've been given, which is in the form of a reviewer reviewing that book. Incredibly smart, incredibly innovative, and I think very much the offspring, the result of Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire. So Pale Fire, Nabokov was also in my 10 Titans. Pale Fire, as a reminder, starts with a long poem called Pale Fire. And then the majority of the book is actually annotations of this, line by line annotations, where he goes through and he talks about the various lines in this poem. And just like people would annotate a poem, right? That's the thing that's done. But the annotations themselves wind up being the novel, and they don't so much reveal about the poem, there's some of that, but they mostly reveal about the annotator, right? And the story of the annotator, and that character is what we get out of the annotations in Pale Fire. So this is Nabokov, right? Saying, I'm going to start with this work, and I'm going to make this criticism of this work, or this discussion of the work, be the real interesting literary work here. Although the poem is great. It's a great poem. But then Lem says, okay, well, fine. Hold my beer. I'm going to do one better. I'm not going to have the books at all. I'm only going to have the reviews. And you get to go and you get to reconstruct the books out of the reviews. So, very smart stuff. Now, can we do even better than that? Well, yes, we can. So, let's talk. We've already talked about Kurt Vonnegut in my metafiction episode. We talked about Kurt Vonnegut, what is metafiction, and in particular about his book, Breakfast of Champions, which is a great masterwork of postmodern metafiction. And one of the characters that recurs in Vonnegut's writing and is in Breakfast of Champions pretty prominently is someone named Kilgore Trout. And Kilgore Trout is an author of schlocky B pulp science fiction. And he writes this, not particularly erudite or literary science fiction. And one of the books that's mentioned explicitly in Breakfast of Champions is called Venus on the Half Shell. So you can imagine my surprise one day when I'm looking through a used bookstore and I find Venus on the Half Shell by Kilgore Trout sitting there on the shelf. My God, there's a picture of Kilgore Trout and a little author's bio on the back. So Venus on the Half Shell, the Kilgore Trout novel, the purely fictional novel that is discussed in his fictional novel Breakfast of Champions, which is itself metafictional, has sprung out of the book and become a real thing that exists in real life. So obviously I bought it. Of course I bought it. I bought it because I have it. And then I researched it because I needed to know what was going on. It's an interesting story. So it was not, you might imagine, oh, well, clearly that was written by Kurt Vonnegut as a companion to either Breakfast of Champions or other books that talk about Kilgore Trout. That would be incorrect, even though it would be a great assumption. It was actually written by Philip Jose Farmer. Apparently, Philip was a farmer, and Kurt Vonnegut, who were quite friendly with each other. Philip is a farmer who clearly has some of the metafictional in himself, said, this would be great if we made Venus in the Half Shell into a real book. And Kurt Vonnegut gave him permission to do so. Philip Jose Farmer wrote this, and ultimately it was published under the name Kilgore Trout. Now, I'm given to understand that subsequent printings put Philip Jose Farmer's name on the cover of the book and on, and on the inside. And did that, see, it's not on the inside. It just says Venus on the Half Shell from Kilgore Trout. And it's got a list of Kilgore Trout's other books, right? Did that explicitly because everybody had just assumed it had been written by Kurt Vonnegut. And Kurt Vonnegut didn't feel good taking credit for a book he hadn't written or getting credit for a book he hadn't written. And also Philip Jose Farmer wanted credit for the book he wrote. So apparently in subsequent printings of this, which there were, it says Philip Jose Farmer on it. Now, obviously, it's much cooler, and I'm much happier to own the version, the unadulterated Kilgore Trout version that clearly is the product of author Kilgore Trout. So these are great examples, I think, of how metafictionists have taken imaginary books, not metafictionists, postmodernists, which I guess in this case they must be metafictionists to some degree, have taken a book as a fiction, the presence and reality of the book as a fiction, and have done interesting things with them. Thank you.